I'm Celine Williams, and welcome to the Leading Through Crisis podcast, a conversation series exploring leadership in challenging times. Hi, I'm Celine Williams, and I'm here today with Ron Carucci. Ron is the managing partner at Navalent, best-selling author of 8 books, and a frequent contributor to HBR and Forbes. He's been featured in Fortune, MSNBC, Inc., Fast Company, CEO Magazine, and is a 2-time TEDx speaker. Ron, thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Celine, what a pleasure. It's been fun to get to know you, and I'm glad to be here with you.
We have discovered that we might be long-lost relatives based on our family heritage, so it has been wonderful to get to know you as well.
You definitely win the award for best podcast pre-show conversation, in the 400 that I've done.
Thank you. I will absolutely take that. So this podcast is all about talking about leading in challenging times. And so you have a ton of experience and obviously, author of 8 best-selling books. That's incredible. So I would love to know really general starting point. When you hear leading through crisis or leading through challenging times, what comes up for you, or where do you start inside of that from your perspective?
Well, certainly the last 10 months have given us all of us a crash course in, how many new things that means, right? The thing that I'm most fixated on these days is what leaders fail to understand is that leading during a crisis is not what you do to other people or for other people. But the first and foremost starting place is not your own agency. It's your own self-regulation. What leaders often fail to recognize, and I think this pandemic has revealed this, is that their response to the crisis leaks into their leadership far more than they want to believe. It shapes their choices of how they treat others far more than they want to acknowledge. They believe they're hiding and sort of quarantining their own responses more effectively than they ever are. And so the starting place is, how are you metabolizing the crisis? How is it affecting you, and how are you being honest about what this is requiring of you before you can ever get to what leadership behaviors do I employ to help others? This really is the case where you have to put your own oxygen mask on first. And many leaders start with the assumption of, I don't need it.
I think that's really interesting because I've definitely seen that come to light. And I see it in sort of, forgive the term, traditional organizations where you don't talk about feelings. You have to show up as rational and logical, which is almost in denial of what you're talking about, which is, what is your experience?
Yeah. Your worst line of defense as a leader is trying to look put together. I have coached so many executives on, one of the articles I wrote was how to answer the unanswerable question. So many leaders assume that they're the answer ATM. And when leaders ask them the questions that are impossible to answer, they feel obligated to make one up, which is the worst thing you can do, right? The words, I don't know, let's find out together, are your absolute most credibility building and empathic words you can offer. First of all, your people know you don't know, right? It doesn't stop their irrational need to want to know. And you are the person in authority, therefore you're the most likely person to ask. But you trying to reassure people with reassurances that aren't yours to give, and that maybe aren't even makeable, is cruel. You're just self-soothing. You're calming your own sense of unease and lack of control by imposing certainty on something that you can't to reassure other people in ways you shouldn't. And it just sets up a vicious cycle.
I hear you say that. It immediately makes me think of Brene Brown when she talks about vulnerability versus oversharing, where vulnerability is a connecting, and it helps people feel like they're in it together. And oversharing actually, I'm really simplifying this obviously, but basically alienates the people in a similar way. It's not that, but it reminds me of that difference between when you think you have to have the answer and you're giving false hope, you're actually alienating people. You're doing the exact opposite of what I think a lot of leaders, what their intention is, right? Their intention is not that, and yet that's the result of it.
Yeah, it's so true. Oversharing, it's interesting. Vulnerability creates authentic intimacy with people, and that's what you need as a leader. You need to be creating cohesion among otherwise fractured organizations, especially in the working from home world. Oversharing is an attempt to purchase intimacy, right? And it's manipulative, and people will see right through it. Your best ability to offer hope is to let people discover their own. And the best question you can ask somebody when you're trying to offer them hope is not telling them why it's going to be okay, is asking them to discover that for themselves. Ask the question, what's the worst thing you lived through in your life? At any point in that time, did you feel like you couldn't do it? Mm-hmm. How does what you learned there apply here? Invite people to discover hope. Don't make them borrow yours. Tell them where you have found hope. Tell them what you're doing in your moments of anxiety and uncertainty. Tell them how you're metabolizing and working through the oh shit moments. But don't try and tell them how to do it. The minute you become the sage advisor, you're condescending, you're belittling them, and you're making them dependent on you for things they should be self-dependent on for. When you don't know the answer to a question about financial risk or when something's going to change, I had one woman in a client, this is a few months ago before the return to work started to happen. She made the mistake. Again, it was in a public town hall. Somebody asked her after the session, I don't know how I can take this anymore. And what she was looking for was comfort and empathy. Well, what she made the mistake of doing was saying, well, I've heard they're thinking about actually reopening the office in mid-June. Within an hour, she had 30 texts. I can't come back to work in mid-June. Where's my office going to be? With questions, she just started a firestorm. Because of her own need to answer a question that wasn't even being asked. Leaders have to listen for what's the deeper question being asked. What's the need that people are actually offering you and the question of their words. They may be asking you, how much government stimulus money are we going to be able to get? What they're really asking is, will I be able to pay my mortgage next month? Mm-hmm. And it's important that you listen for the deeper need. It doesn't mean you should offer an answer to either, but acknowledging I think I hear a different question beneath those words. Am I right in wondering that you're concerned about this? Creates a level of authenticity, and it says to people, it's okay not to know. And it's okay that sometimes we're not okay. And we can be not okay together. And leaders, for all of the facades we told them to put on about looking in control, as much as we've said your vulnerability is your strongest place of credibility, your weakness is your strength. This is the time to prove that. Because if the minute you try and tell people who are scared not to be, or why not to be, or how it's all going to work itself out, you're going to be held accountable to those statements, and they're going to come back to bite you. Because the second after your guarantee proves false, they're going to come at you like with pitchforks. And so your best bet is to say, what can we learn together? Here's what we do know. What can we figure out on our own? What can we work on together? What can we do in the meantime of not knowing? Right? And rather than grasp at straws, reach for the things you do know. Reach for the things that aren't going to change. Reach for the sense of purpose you want to create among the people you're working with. And in some cases, relay your foundation when it wasn't that to something more sustainable.
I think that's absolutely brilliant advice. And I imagine that leaders, when they hear that, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of leaders, when they hear that, don't even know where to start. It feels so scary and new and uncomfortable because, to what you said, they're the answer ATM. They have to solve all the problems. That's what they've been sold. The higher you are in an organization, the more responsibility you have, whatever you want to call it. You have to make the decisions and solve the problems. So for those who are feeling that I don't even know where to start inside of this, what would you recommend?
Great question, Celine. So I would say in your next team meeting, say something like, like all of us, I've been thinking a lot about this pandemic and when the hell's it going to be over? Maybe it's never going to be over. But I was thinking a year from now, we're all going to say something about how this pandemic changed us. And it occurred to me that it's not entirely written what the answer to that question is going to be. And even though we're 6 months into this, we still have a chance to write that story. I'm curious. I'd love to hear from each of you. What do you hope will be true a year from now about you and us? What do you want to say? Who do you want to say we became as a result of this? Because there's going to be an answer to the question. But until that history is written yet, let's see if we can decide what we want it to be. I've thought about it, and I'll share my thoughts, but I want to hear yours first. And just get people talking about a bigger story than the one you're in right today, right? Than today's cash flow emergency, or today's customer emergency, or today's revenue shortfall. Those will be there in a minute. But take time and ask yourself, do we understand the bigger story we're in? And let's talk about that. Another question you can ask that I think is very powerful is, and I think many leaders are facing the fact that the pandemic didn't cause some of the business struggles or the business weaknesses you're experiencing, but it did reveal them.
Absolutely.
They were there all the time, and now the lack of cultural cohesion, the lack of strategic clarity, the lack of shared processes that scale, the things that were glued together with chewing gum and spitballs to keep your business operating are going to run their course now, right? Under the test of a pandemic. So rather than trying to hide those, for goodness sake, use the invitation to fix them. For leaders who had already created a sense of shared purpose and reasoning, who had painted a picture of a greater good to serve, who had a lot of equity they built up with people they had served and invested in, that equity came back to play for you nicely. And that's good for you. But it doesn't mean it's too late to create it. So ask the question of your people, we all come to work for more than a paycheck. If we're honest with ourselves, it's not just to pay our bills we come here, even though we might tell ourselves it is because we may hate the work. But the reality is we all want a greater sense of meaning out of this than just a fiduciary one. And I've decided that I want a different relationship with you other than your boss and the person who writes your check. So if we flip the script and I said to you, let's pretend for a second you don't work for the company. This company works for you. And this company is the vehicle through which you get to live out the reason you're on the planet. That you get to use your 50 hours a week here as a way to leave your unique fingerprint on a world and go to bed at night feeling proud of what you did and wake up in the morning thinking, I'm looking forward to doing it again. What would that be? What would be the fingerprint that this part of your life gets to help you imprint? Make everybody answer. And get the conversation started. And you as a boss, shut up while we're talking. Don't speak. And if there's silence and awkward, whatever, because there's like what kind of drugs did he take today? Let it be awkward. That's okay. But somebody will start, and then it will build. And you will be amazed at what you learn about these people, what they learn about each other that I had no idea. And for goodness sake, don't waste it. You will get gold about how to create environments that motivate them to do their best work, about how you can support things that they believe in, and about how to maybe shift some of the bullcrap work you shouldn't be doing anyway and replace it with better activities that add more value to your customers and them. You will get a gold mine of insights about your business and you. Some of those you might not like, but that's okay. Trust me, you are the topic of conversation at all the dinner tables every night. You should know what the stories that they're telling are. And if you don't know, it probably means it's probably not that good. So this is a way to just reorient the conversation with some simple prompts that start people thinking differently about you and the work.
I think I think it's an ideal time to be shifting that conversation and using the opportunity that's in front of us to shift the conversation. Yep. I think that the two prompts that you gave specifically are brilliant. I say that as you were saying them, I was like, oh, I wish more leaders were asking those specific questions the way that you phrased them, because there is a huge opportunity. And it also reminds me how many leaders struggle to just listen when people are sharing their side of things, right? That again, they have to solve the problem. So if you share that this organization is your vehicle to whatever your purpose is, I think a lot of leaders will struggle with just taking that in.
Hey, thank you. Because they want to one up. Oh, I feel the same way too. Here's how I do, and they're going to do not hijack the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Do not feel the need to insert your thoughts after that's not your job. Just say, thanks so much. I learned something new about you, and this is what it was, and I'm so grateful. Who's next?
Right.
That's it.
Right. I wonder, it makes me wonder why that is such a struggle for, people in general, but leaders specifically, to not one up.
So most leaders, especially most leaders have some version of an imposter syndrome. They have some reason that they fear getting found out, right? At some point, you're going to realize this is an area I'm not competent in to be in this job. Put yourself at ease. They already know. They know better than you. So, they know what part of the emperor is naked is real clear to them. They've studied you. Don't worry about hiding it. You just don't waste your energy. So to quell the anxiety of that imposter syndrome and to keep the playing field on level, consuming airtime becomes a bizarre metric of, I consume the airtime with more wisdom that you think is wise. They probably could care less about. I self-soothe my need to make sure I'm still the boss. It backfires. It actually is disrespectful, dismissive, and to use your great word before, alienating. Yeah. But the leaders still can control the impulse to fill the silence. In a knowledge economy, verbalism is the currency. And so I'm going to spend the most. When in fact, your silence is probably your greatest value you can contribute. So I want to offer an observation here, because it just reminded me of when I started learning to coach. So when I started taking coach training and going through all the formal stuff, and we did classes on listening and whatever, and my default is to fill the silence. So when, you ask a question, and if someone doesn't immediately answer, like 1 second maximum, I was like, oh, let me rephrase the question, or ask a different way, or say something to help guide you to a certain, right? Like that. I have that in me, and I see that. And it's really interesting, because I think of where I was, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, and I started really realizing how ingrained that is in me. And now how comfortable I am just being in silence, to the point that in group settings, I'll ask a question, and if no one answers, I'm like, we can sit here for 2 minutes. It does not faze me anymore. Yeah. And I love that and I say that because the connection you made to the knowledge economy is so real. That is the thing that prevented me from being comfortable with it for so long, is if I didn't have something to say, I didn't have value. Yep. It's so true. And when you compound the fact that today people's remits are analyses, ideas, imagination, right? You create two problems. One is we're still evaluating people's work apart from the fact that the contribution is an extension of the contributor. It is. You can't say it's not personal. It's personal, right? So as leaders, when you esteem somebody's contribution, you are esteeming them as the contributor. One of the greatest gifts a leader can give. People struggle with how to say thank you and show appreciation, and they do all these cheesy attaboy, crappy things. I've asked leaders all the time. I ask audiences all the time. How many of you have ever received a compliment from your boss that insulted you? And half the hands in the room go up. And I say, well, why was their intention to be honoring of you so offensive? They didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what it took. It felt contrived. Ask for the story. Just simply say to somebody, wow, you must be really proud of achieving that. I'm sure I have no idea what it took. Tell me how you did it. It is one of the most, ask for the story. Watch them light up. Watch them tell you where they struggled. Watch them tell you where they had new insights and breakthroughs. You're now honoring and refusing the contribution as the contributor, rather than trying to evaluate the work as if it wasn't part of who they were. It's a place we're behind in a working economy of knowledge. Second thing is when it's you and I, when your work is advising, when your work is you're being paid to have an answer as a consultant, you're really prone to not shut your mouth. And
yes, we are.
And your sense of obsolescence is easily triggered, and your fear of irrelevance, is lurking beneath the surface all the time when your client has a question, or I don't know that I subscribe to the theory that coaches should only ask questions and be Socratic and never have advice. I think that's clients pay us too much money. They want answers.
Agreed.
And sometimes I just need to tell you what the hell to do. Don't ever say that again. Say this. But sometimes you have to let the discovery happen. And when to, on that continuum of inquiry and advocacy, where do you fall is often a hard balance. But when you're indulging your own need for relevance with your words, and you're not aware that you're doing it, you're pissing your clients off.
I really, first of all, inquiry and advocacy in that scale and where you put that really speaks to me. And I think that is a great way of thinking about it as consultants and coaches, but also as leaders. And it makes me think that inside of organizations that are promoting coaching conversations where they're, working towards, whether they're there or not, but they're working towards a culture that is sort of steeped in the structures of coaching, because there are many benefits. I think that's a really important scale to keep in mind, that even not as a formal coach or consultant, that having that in mind, and when you are speaking to advocate for yourself or to out of that fear of relevancy or to ego just to say your piece of it, that's not serving the person that you're in conversation with, full stop.
Yeah. Well, and of course, that's Peter Senge's good work. I don't get credit for that. It's Peter Senge's brilliance. But I do think that one of the things that's fun to do in a meeting is to sort of, I do a little hashtag that, I keep little marks, is to count the number of declarative sentences people speak in versus the number of questions people ask. And of course, there's a correlation to hierarchy. The more higher up you are, the more. So what you haven't got is, there's no dialogue. It's just a series of simultaneous monologues, right? And then you watch, someone declares a sentence, someone gets triggered to think something else, they hijack the conversation, makes another declarative sentences. There's no response to the declaration I heard, even in disagreement, because we're going to avoid conflict. So you just have this series of declarations, and then meeting over. And so pointing out and holding up a mirror to say, I counted 246 declarative sentences and only 9 questions. And the questions were almost always about, could you repeat the statement? It wasn't about why you said it or why you believed it, or it wasn't drawing out the silent person saying, you haven't said much. What are your thoughts? It was just this proliferation of your self-advocacy of your own point of view, which means your goal is not to learn, your goal is to win. Mm-hmm. Or your goal is to be right, and why they're wrong. Especially if it's a binary conversation, right? So if the conversation has devolved into this either or thing, and by the way, to your original question, during crisis, our proclivity toward binaryism is much stronger. We want to reduce the number of options down to 2 and then fight over which is right. Mm-hmm. And in a place where our social media is trying to polarize us, where fear and anxiety at unprecedented levels are polarizing us, binaries become seductively comfortable because I get to win.
Yeah.
And be right, even if I'm not.
Yeah.
And so your ability to put that aside, get more options at the table, ask more questions. Don't just be curious. That's passive. Be fascinated. When someone says something that triggers you and you think is bizarre, be anthropological. Wow, I had never thought of that. Say more. And get them talking more.
I'm totally going to steal your hashtags of declarative statements and questions. I'm going to own that right now. I'm going to steal that, and I will always credit you with it. But I think that's I think that's brilliant. And when you hold up a mirror and you say, "Listen, I heard 246," which seems like a lot, declarative sentences. I believe it just seems
like a 2-hour meeting. You can get there in 30 minutes, and a 2-hour meeting is probably bigger than that. I stopped counting,
which is astonishing. And 9 questions. What is the next step of that? If you say, here's the mirror, here's what's happening, then what?
So I have to tie it back to, what is it a diagnosis of, right?
Sure.
So if one of your stated goals as the team was to be more cohesive, was to have greater trust, or to just be more effective in your governance, come together, your governing body. If I tally up the room, it's probably $8,000 an hour to convene you for 3 hours. Is anybody getting their money's worth here besides you? And if you never met, would anybody care? So You're here to solve problems. You have this agenda. You're here to make decisions. So in the service of that, let's talk about whether or not 247 consecutive declarative sentences from only 2/3 of you, silence from 3 of you, and only 6 questions. You tell me, how does that qualitatively impact this agenda? You said you were here to solve for a fourth quarter revenue shortfall. There were 27 declarative sentences on how that might happen. None of the ideas got written down. No one built on the ideas. No one actually tried to land them and say, here's who's going to do what. No name got assigned. Tell me how filling the room with your voices without disagreement or without much, or you assumed your next declarative sentence, which subtly was the opposite of what the last one was, which means you're not disagreeing, but you never said I disagree with you and here's why. We're supposed to now just accept the fact that that one's off the table and yours just trumped it. Was that an assumption you made? How did you feel about that? Did you feel unheard or dismissed because she did that? Or how'd that go? We didn't talk about any of that. So you tell me if this is what happened in the room, and I'm an anthropologist, if this is the only data I have is your agenda, the time you met, and that this many declarative sentences away, what would that tell me? What would you want me to learn about you from those data points? Let them talk. And we don't listen well. That's true. Because many of the declarative sentences were beginning before the last one ended, which means you were just listening to respond, not listening to understand. Many of them happened at the same time, so they were over each other. So you had the sort of the upskilled gift of actually cramming your 246 declarative sentences into the time it takes to speak 100. So you overachieved. So tell me, how do you want to work on this?
I would love to be a fly on the wall of so many rooms having that conversation after you've observed something like that, because I can only imagine the reactions and how difficult it is for them for people in general. I think this is true in a lot of places, but to hear that reflection, especially when it's put back on them in that way. And I think that's the real power in it.
Well, thank you, Salim, and you're welcome to come and watch any room you want. Most people are relieved. Most people don't get offended. Sometimes I have to call out the leader a little bit, but I've warned them in advance. I'm here to help create teachable moments for you. Sometimes the teachable moment's going to be you. That's your job. It's each of your remits to this team. One of your remits for each of you is your own learning moment. Right? You're here on behalf of the whole group to help them improve. Sometimes that's because of your stupidity. So welcome it. And so sometimes the leaders, when they overspeak, or they speak too much, or they interrupt, or I'll do the gentle, let her finish, stop, let her finish, please continue thing. Or if they interrupt 4 times, I'm going to say, okay, that's the last time I'm going to remind you here. Next time I get the duct tape out. Or if I know, for example, a leader just, they are so verbose, they just can't, I give them poker chips. And the poker chips have, the number 30, 60, or 90 on them. And they have a small set of them. And they can play them. Whenever they're going to speak, it's a 30-second chip, a 60-second chip, or a 90-second chip. They get only 2 90-second chips. And 90 seconds, I turn the sand thing over and I stop them. So you got to be really thoughtful about when you're going to interject. Because every time you open your mouth, and when you're out of poker chips, you're quiet. You cannot speak anymore. So it's a very contrived but forcing mechanism to say, when you're the leader, your voice carries more weight because it just does. Are you judicious and prudent about when you spend that voice? Because if your goal is not to get the voices of everybody else in the room heard and acted upon, you're just teaching them to be dependent on you. They're coming as spectators to observe you be brilliant and have all the answers. And then guess what? To actually implement all the answers too. Because you created no sense of ownership in it at all. So they're just coming here to watch you or they're here to catch up on their email. While nodding their head at you.
The amount of, one of the things that I hear inside of that is that you are very intentional with how you're showing up, but you're also creating intentionality in them and in the room and in the space of how things, whatever you're working towards, how people are showing up, how they're speaking. And I think that there's a lot of, my personal lens is that there's not enough intention that happens in the world right now. And in general, we tend to be reactive. We don't go in with a sense of intention. And so I think that you creating that and showing up that way and encouraging it then allows it to permeate organizations, other teams, and changes that conversation, whatever, changes the way we operate from reaction all the time to mindfulness and thoughtfulness and intentionality. And that's a whole different way of leading through times of crisis.
Well, I mean, whether you ever thought it was a luxury or a nice to have or a sort of a meta skill of the few sages in the world before, that's not the case now. It is today. It is table stakes. And if you haven't figured out how to self-regulate now, you're in trouble because people often confuse self-awareness with self-absorption, right? Because just because you think about yourself a lot doesn't mean you're self-aware. It just means you're self-absorbed. Knowing how others experience you and knowing how you intend to be experienced, and knowing when there's a gap between your intent and your impact it's the price of entry to the world today in the professional world. And if you're not, especially for those persistent behaviors that you think, here's the thing. If there's a behavior that you display that after each time you do it, you say to yourself, why do I keep doing that? Well, there's a reason. This is not some random behavior you chose to be destructive. That means there's a root on that behavior that's historical. And whatever techniques you've employed, biting your tongue, snapping a rubber band, whatever it is, to get you to stop are foolish because that narrative, whatever that narrative is in your head, it has control over your behavior at any point you're triggered. So if you don't know what triggers it or why that triggers it, it's, that woman across the table just became your high school gym teacher and jump across the table, right? If you don't know the stories that form that behavior, you're going to keep repeating them. Our unwanted behaviors are not random. Mm-hmm. They are all reflective of issues or moments in our world and in our stories we didn't fix. And so whatever that persistent behavior you reach for, verbosity, your temper, your freezing up, your fear, your fear of what other people think of you, your certainty that people in the corner whispering are talking about you. Mm-hmm. Whatever those moments are, those are narratives that you're using to make sense of the world, often inaccurately. And so if you don't know the history of the origins of those stories, you will continue to repeat them and you will infect others with them.
I think that is a wonderful place to wrap this up. I think it is a great way to end what we've been talking about. Is there anything that you would like to say that you didn't get a chance to say or that you want to re-emphasize before we get to the end of this?
Nothing that nothing worth repeating for sure, but certainly I would say take a breath. These are hard moments. You have to care for yourself. You have to have your oxygen mask on first. You have to care for your mental health, care for your physical health. Let go of your Herculean expectations that you have to bear this alone or on your shoulders on behalf of anybody. You're doing nobody any favors. Take a breath, care for yourself, embrace your imperfections because they are an asset. Not when they're hidden, but when you expose them, your vulnerability is your greatest strength.
Yeah, I think that is perfect. I want to thank you for joining me today. I know that you have an ebook that's available, Designing the Virtual Workplace, I believe is what it's called. And we will have all the links to Ron and his book in the show notes and available on the website. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, Ron. I really appreciate it. And it was wonderful to hear your perspective. I know it's going to be super valuable to all the listeners.
Well, Celine, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for you. You take good care and thanks for your good work on the world.
You as well. Thanks for joining me today on the Leading Through Crisis podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a minute to rate and review it in your podcast app. And you can always learn more about any of our guests at www.leadingthroughcrisis.com.